Welcome to Hartman Math. This is lesson 3.4, factor by grouping. And this is a strategy that we're going to use when our expression has four terms. So example number 1, factor the expression x cubed plus 3x squared plus 5x plus 15. There are four terms. So step number 1 is the grouping part. We're going to group with parentheses. And a high majority of the time, we would want to group the first two terms together and the second two terms together. I should say the last two terms. So we're going to insert the parentheses right there. And then we're going to factor each group separately. So we're going to go back. We're going to take a look at this. And usually this is going to be GCF factor. Greatest common factor. So we're looking for, okay, what's in common between x to the third plus 3x squared? The most that's in common. So this is 3x's being multiplied together. This is 2x's. So both of them have 2x's being multiplied together. So we're going to factor out x squared. That's part 2. We're going to factor both of the expressions. So in this one, we're factoring out an x squared. X squared times x makes x to the third. X squared times positive 3 makes positive 3x squared. Now we're going to factor out the second group. Again, it's probably going to be GCF. We see a 5 in common. We're going to factor out the 5. Now what we're checking for after we've done this is the parentheses, do they match? They're probably going to need to match because our next step is to take the greatest common factor now, where our plus sign, we've got two parts here. What's in common? There's an x plus 3 that's in common. We're going to take that to the front. We have the common x plus 3. And then the leftovers, once we remove and remove, that goes in the second set of parentheses. So we're talking about x squared plus 5 goes in the second set. And that's factor by grouping. Go ahead and pause the video here. Try to factor this expression by grouping. Hit play when you're ready. We're going to take the same steps. We're going to group the first two and the last two together with parentheses. We're going to factor, usually GCF, factor out an x squared. Factor out a 10. Notice that the x minus 2's match. That's good news. Those are our common factors. They go to the front. Leftovers go behind. Example number 2. Do the same thing. What's a little bit more challenging on this one is when the middle sign is a minus. That becomes a little bit tricky. There's different ways to handle it. Here's how we're going to do it. When we go ahead and group there, we're going to keep the minus with the 9x, and then we're going to have to insert a plus sign between the two parentheses. Say we're taking this plus this. After we've done that, the rest is pretty much the same. We're going to factor out the greatest common factor. It's an x squared. Over here, we're going to factor out the greatest common factor, but when we do it, we're going to have to include the negative with it. Okay? And if there wasn't anything in common, we'd factor out a -1. But here, we've got a 9 in common, so we're going to factor out -9. It has to be the negative that's coming out. And that would mean -9 times x is -9x. -9 times -4 is positive 36. So make sure that this is the minus there when we did factor out a negative. Then it matches, because if it was a +4, you think something has gone wrong. And again, think of what would I multiply -9 by to get the positive 36. That's why it's -4. Now we have an x minus 4 in common. That goes to the front. The leftovers are x squared and -9. Now, there's no box around it, which suggests we might not be done. So we're going to take a look at our quadratic expression that has two terms. Think back to our previous lesson. When there are two terms, we might be able to do difference of squares. It's a difference, that's a square, and that's a square. So we're going to factor this, break it up into difference of squares. Remember, the fronts have to be the same, so what would we square to get x squared? X, that goes in the fronts. What would we square to get the 9? 3, that's going to go behind. So x plus 3, x minus 3, it doesn't matter which is the plus and which is the minus. All right, go ahead and pause the video here. 4 terms, factor by grouping. Hit play when you're ready. All right, so again, we've got this challenge where there's a negative right there. So we're going to start with factoring in the grouping with the parentheses, putting a plus in the middle there, keeping the negative with the 5x minus 1. All right, what do we have in common here? Well, there's a 2 in common and an x squared. So we're going to factor out 2x squared. And then here, we're factoring out a negative, and it's okay if you think of this as negative 1. Because there was nothing else that we could really factor out, but we did have to factor out the negative, and we could think of it as negative 1. And that actually might help in the next step. Because we have our common 5x plus 1, and the leftovers would be 2x squared minus 1. I think that's as far as we can go, because it's a difference. But the 2 kind of means it's not going to be a difference of squares, because 2 is not a square. So that's as far as we can go. So just to kind of summarize where we've been with some of our factoring. Number 1, always, and this is our factoring flow chart to kind of determine the strategies that you want to use in a factoring problem. Always think GCF first. Don't try something else before you consider GCF. After that, we're going to count how many terms either the expression has, or if we've done GCF, how many terms are in the parentheses. Because if there's 3, we're going to do double bubble. If there's 2, we're going to see if it's a difference of squares. And if there's 4, we just learned how to do that. That's factor by grouping. That's it for today. I'll see you next time.